Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you are an entrepreneur trying to land a new client, a job seeker sitting in an interview, or honestly, literally just trying to convince your friends where to eat dinner tonight, you're in the business of selling. We all are.
Yeah, we really are.
But there is a very real possibility that everything we have been taught about persuasion, the entire framework we use to get to a yes, is completely backwards.
It is a really profound premise, and it challenges, the very foundation of how we communicate when we want an outcome to go our way. We're just so conditioned to push for an agreement that we rarely stop to examine the mechanics of what that pushing actually does to the other person.
Right. And that brings us to today's source material. We are looking at excerpts from a deeply unconventional book. It's called High Probability Selling by Jacques Werth and Nicholas E. Ruben. And, the subtitle alone makes a rather massive promise.
It does.
It says that it, quote, reinvents the selling process.
And looking at the text, the authors are entirely serious about that reinvention. They aren't offering a few incremental tweaks or clever new closing techniques.
Oh, not at all.
They're essentially tearing the traditional sales house down to the studs and rebuilding it on a completely different foundation.
So our mission for this deep dive is to extract the ultimate shortcut to stress-free, high-integrity communication from this text. We are going to unlearn the manipulative, exhausting tactics of traditional sales and discover a radically honest paradigm that actually respects both the buyer and the seller.
Which is something I think everyone listening could use more of.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the solution, we first have to understand the problem. And the authors frame this problem around the concept of a paradigm.
Right. A paradigm is essentially the invisible lens through which you view the world. And the authors use a brilliant historical analogy here. Think about the flat Earth paradigm.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
For a long time, people believed the Earth was flat. It wasn't treated as a debate or a theory. It was simply the water they swam in. It defined the absolute limits of what was considered possible.
Or like consider early medicine.
Exactly.
Before the discovery of germs, doctors operated in a paradigm where disease was caused by evil humors, or vapors in the air. Meaning, if you don't even know that germs exist, the concept of washing your hands before a surgery wouldn't even cross your mind.
That is the core issue. You cannot fix a systemic problem if your entire framework for reality is fundamentally flawed. The authors argue that modern salespeople are operating in a paradigm so ubiquitous that they don't even recognize they are in it.
Like the fish in water.
Yes. It is the paradigm of traditional selling, which fundamentally operates on a hunter versus prey dynamic.
The hunter and the prey.
Right. The unexamined foundational belief of this paradigm is that the ultimate goal of selling is to get the prospect to buy.
Which sounds completely logical on the surface, doesn't it? Until you look at the mechanics of how it is actually executed. The book breaks down this old paradigm into the classic five-step model that almost every professional is taught in some form.
The old reliable.
Right. You have attention, interest, desire, conviction, and action, which is the close. And it requires the seller to put on a relentless performance. You have to manufacture their attention with a gimmick, generate artificial interest, put on a massive presentation to create desire, prove your worth with a barrage of statistics for conviction, and then finally try to push them into action.
And that framework inherently requires you to manipulate the prospect through a series of psychological states.
Yeah.
It operates on the assumption that you can, and you should, persuade someone to purchase something, even if they didn't wake up that morning with any intention of doing so.
It is the equivalent of trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong spot by just pressing harder.
Yes, exactly.
The seller is out there handling endless objections, doing all the talking, and basically attempting to verbally wrestle people into submission. And the text highlights that the emotional toll of this process is devastating for everyone involved.
The psychological damage inflicted on both sides of the table is severe. For the prospect, this traditional paradigm makes them feel hunted. They feel suspicious and pressured.
Because they are being hunted.
Right. It feels inherently adversarial. That underlying feeling of being pushed is exactly what generates what the industry calls sales resistance. And on the other side of the desk, the salesperson feels desperate, vulnerable, and constantly subjected to rejection.
That dynamic easily explains why the general public universally dislikes being sold to, and why the sales profession has such an incredibly high burnout rate.
It's exhausting.
It really is. But the shift introduced in the text completely abandons that dynamic. This new paradigm is called high probability selling, or HPS. In this framework, the goal is not to get the prospect to buy. The goal is simply to determine if there is a mutually acceptable basis for doing business.
The implications of that shift are massive. If your objective is no longer to persuade another human being, the psychological pressure completely vanishes from the interaction.
Go on.
Completely.
To see how this plays out practically, we can look at how the book treats prospecting. There is a fantastic analogy involving a standard deck of playing cards. Imagine the deck is face down on a table. I tell you that I will give you $5 for every ace you can find in the next 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm with you.
You flip the very first card, and it's a 6 of clubs. The question the book asks is, how much time do you spend trying to convince that 6 that it's really an ace?
You wouldn't waste a single second on it. You would immediately flip it over and move on to the next card to maximize your time.
Yet in traditional sales, professionals spend hours, weeks, sometimes months trying to persuade a 6 to become an ace.
It's wild when you frame it that way.
In high probability selling, prospecting is strictly about sorting the deck. You are never selling the appointment. You aren't trying to charm or trick someone into taking a meeting. You are purely trying to identify the people who already need, want, and can afford your product right now.
And the methodology the text provides for doing this is highly disciplined. It introduces the concept of the 45-word offer. When reaching out to a prospect, the initial pitch must be extremely concise, capped at 45 words or fewer.
That is so short.
It is. But even more critical than the word count is the delivery. It must be spoken in a completely flat, unemotional tone.
So absolutely no manufactured enthusiasm, no bright, overly energetic greetings asking how their Tuesday is going.
None of that. Any added emotion or any attempt to sound overly friendly or convincing immediately triggers that ingrained sales resistance.
Oh, because it feels like a pitch.
Exactly. The prospect's subconscious detects the performance, feels the impending pressure, and instantly puts a guard up. By keeping the tone flat and the words precise, you are simply stating a factual reality about what you offer, allowing the prospect to evaluate it objectively.
The book illustrates this beautifully with a salesperson character named Sue. She's making cold calls, and she delivers her short, strictly factual pitch, just boom, boom, boom. And then she ends the call with what the authors consider the magic HPS question. She asks the prospect, is this something you want or not?
What's fascinating here is the profound psychological effect of giving the prospect an explicit out. When you add or not, or when you verbally signal to a prospect that it is completely acceptable to say no, their natural defensive posture evaporates.
The tension just leaves the conversation entirely.
Because when people know you are genuinely willing to accept no as a complete sentence, they suddenly feel safe enough to be honest with you. They don't have to formulate polite excuses to get you off the phone.
Oh, I have to go to a meeting, yeah.
Right. You aren't trying to corner them into a meeting. You're simply acting as a mutual sorting mechanism to see if a continued conversation makes logical sense.
That completely shifts the power dynamic. It removes the emotional burden of rejection from the seller's shoulders. You are just flipping cards looking for aces. Now let's assume you find an ace. They say, yes, I have this problem, let's meet. This brings us to the very first step of the actual face-to-face meeting. And the book is absolute on this point. Establishing a relationship is the most critical step in the entire process.
It is vital to define what establishing a relationship actually means in the high-probability paradigm, because it is not what most people assume. It does not mean engaging in superficial small talk about the weather or pretending to be deeply interested in the sports memorabilia on the prospect's desk to build artificial rapport.
Right. The text actually condemns that kind of fake rapport building as manipulative.
It does. The actual goal here is to determine if you and the prospect share a baseline of mutual trust and respect. The authors have a very strict rule. If you do not trust the prospect, or if you feel the prospect does not respect you, you walk away. You simply do not enter into business agreements with people you don't trust.
There is a detailed story in the text that perfectly demonstrates this. There is a salesperson named Sal who works for a packaging company called WPC. Sal goes into a meeting with a buyer named Tom Merchant. Sal walks into Tom's office, but instead of pulling out glossy brochures or pitching the durability of his cardboard boxes, Sal asks Tom about his personal background.
Sal utilizes open-ended questions that invite genuine reflection. He asks things like, how did you get started in this industry? And what was your career path before taking this role?
Because Sal is asking out of genuine curiosity, Tom actually opens up. He reveals that he was a fine arts major in college, but he abandoned that path for commercial art because he needed a steady income to support his family.
It gets real very fast.
It does. The conversation gets deeply personal. Tom talks about his father, a highly critical man who equated artistic talent strictly with financial success. Tom admits he spent his entire life trying to impress his father and constantly feeling like a disappointment.
Reaching that level of vulnerability in a corporate business meeting is incredibly rare, but it highlights the power of the approach.
And Tom goes on to share a very touching memory. He explains that the day he left for college, his stoic, critical father actually broke down crying, which was the first time Tom realized how much the man truly loved him. Tom then connects this to his own 18-year-old daughter, Jeannie, who is an aspiring artist. He talks about his efforts to nurture her talent in the supportive way his father couldn't manage for him.
The reason this works so beautifully is that Sal was not using a psychological trick to dig up Tom's emotional hot buttons to leverage later in a negotiation. It was a moment of authentic human connection. The text emphasizes that when you ask sincere questions and listen without a hidden agenda, the prospect's intuition recognizes your trustworthiness.
But I'm sure someone listening might be wondering how you bridge the gap between that level of intense emotional vulnerability and a business transaction.
Yeah, it seems jarring.
Right, going from a grown man crying about his father directly into a conversation about shipping containers seems like it would cause massive emotional whiplash.
That is exactly why the foundation of mutual respect is so vital. The transition works because the connection wasn't a tactic. You don't use their vulnerability as a segue into your pitch. You simply acknowledge their human reality, honor it, and then cleanly and respectfully pivot by asking if they are ready to discuss the business at hand. It maintains a peer-to-peer dynamic.
You're treating them like an adult.
Exactly.
Once that foundation of trust is solidified, the salesperson moves into the next phase, discovery and disqualification. This is where the methodology introduces a sequence of 14 specific questions.
These 14 questions are meticulously designed to uncover the absolute reality of the prospect's business situation. And, true to the high probability philosophy, every single question serves as another opportunity for the prospect to disqualify themselves from the process.
Looking at the list, you have questions like, why do you need this? Which forces the buyer to articulate their own pain point rather than the seller guessing it. Then there are logistical tests like, when would you want this to start? And crucial structural questions like, who else has to agree before you make a decision?
That last question is huge. It's designed to prevent a common trap where a salesperson spends weeks pitching to someone who doesn't actually have purchasing authority. This phase also introduces a very strict boundary the authors call the no dancing rule.
No dancing.
Right. If the prospect gives evasive answers or if they refuse to grant you access to the ultimate decision makers, you do not dance around the issue. You politely end the meeting and walk away. You absolutely do not perform free work like assembling extensive quotes or proposals without mutual commitments.
Okay, wait, injecting some authentic skepticism here. If I am a salesperson with a mortgage to pay and a strict quota to hit by Friday, walking away from a prospect who just wants a, quote, sounds like career suicide, how does the book justify taking that kind of risk for someone whose livelihood depends on closing deals?
The book addresses this by distinguishing between an actual pipeline and the illusion of a pipeline. The methodology argues that spending 40 hours creating a proposal for a low-probability prospect who is being evasive is a complete waste of your most valuable asset, which is your time.
That makes sense.
Walking away isn't risking a deal. It is saving the time you need to go find an actual ace. The risk is starving to death while waiting for a six of clubs to change its suit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the ultimate test of this discovery phase is question number 14. Once you have established the needs, you look the prospect in the eye and ask, if I can meet all your criteria, what will you do?
It is a phenomenal qualifying question. It completely paralyzes the traditional evasive sales dance. You are explicitly asking for a commitment to do business before you have even shown your product or provided a price.
To see this in action, we can look at the Ann Kaufman example from the text. A sales executive named VP goes to meet with a buyer named Ann Kaufman and complains that she's having massive quality and delivery issues with the packaging for their specific sun product line. A traditional salesperson would immediately jump at the bait and say, let me get you a quote right now to show you how much better we are.
Of course, that's the instinct. But VP, operating under the HPS paradigm, refuses to do that. He refuses to hand over a free quote and pushes back, stating she wants to see the quote before she brings her product manager into the conversation.
And VP holds his ground. He essentially tells her that he doesn't work that way, explaining he isn't going to quote the job twice. He states they need to talk to the product manager first, and then he gives her the out. He asks, "Is that okay with you or not?"
Her response is telling. She brings the product manager into the loop. VP's strict professional boundaries command respect. Once all decision makers are present, VP negotiates a very specific mutual commitment. He asks them, if my company, WPC, can complete the new artwork in 1 week and deliver the final packaging in 4 weeks, are you committing to giving us this business?
He secures the commitment to buy before he authorizes his team to do the heavy lifting. They agree on the terms, they confirm the product manager will sign off, and the deal structure is set. There is no free consulting. It is just a mutual agreement between adults. And that leads us directly into the final phase of the method: high probability closing and conditions of satisfaction.
Because there's been absolutely no persuasion, manipulation, or coercion leading up to this exact point, the actual close is entirely devoid of stress. It is simply a logistical negotiation. Both parties sit down and write out the exact conditions of satisfaction required to execute the deal.
And the level of granularity required here is intense. You cannot accept vague conditions. The book provides an excellent scenario to illustrate this. If the buyer says, "We want this new display box to be easy to set up," the HPS salesperson doesn't just write down "easy to set up" and move on.
No, because what does easy even mean?
Exactly. They insist on an exact, measurable metric. They will ask, "Can we define easy by measuring if a shipping clerk on your floor can set it up in exactly 50 seconds?"
Insisting on that level of granularity protects both parties. Easy to set up means something very different to a floor manager than it does to a purchasing executive. By defining it as 50 seconds, the buyer knows exactly what standard they are getting, and the seller knows exactly what engineering metric they have to hit to fulfill their end of the commitment. Eliminating ambiguity eliminates the primary cause of post-sale disputes and buyer's remorse.
But the most counterintuitive, mind-bending rule in the entire book happens at the very end of this process. When you have successfully written down all the conditions of satisfaction and everything is agreed upon, you never ask for the order.
Never. It completely violates the golden rule of traditional sales, which is always be closing. In this new paradigm, asking for the order is viewed as a form of lingering pressure. Instead of pushing them over the finish line, you finalize the mutual commitments. You ask, if we hit this 50-second setup time and we hit this specific price point, what will you do?
You require the prospect to verbalize the close. The psychological impact of this is that the prospect feels incredibly empowered. They generated their own commitment to purchase without being backed into a corner by a slick closing technique. They made a proactive choice to buy. They were not sold to.
That is the ultimate victory of high-probability selling. It transforms what is traditionally an adversarial, zero-sum transaction into a genuinely collaborative partnership.
Let's zoom out and summarize the core lesson for you, the listener. High-probability selling is ultimately about swapping the exhausting, soul-crushing act of persuasion for the empowering act of mutual agreement. It requires respecting the other person enough to give them full permission to say no, and crucially, respecting your own time and your own professional worth enough to walk away when the alignment just isn't there.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the applications extend far beyond commercial sales. This framework preserves your time and emotional energy in almost any professional or personal negotiation. Imagine applying this to a difficult salary negotiation, or when pitching an innovative project to a skeptical executive team. When you drop the desperate need to persuade and focus entirely on discovering if there is mutual alignment, your communication becomes entirely frictionless.
So what does this all mean? It means you don't have to be a fast-talking manipulator or a charismatic performer to get what you want out of your career or your life. In fact, operating with radical, unemotional honesty is vastly more effective. I want to leave you with a provocative final thought to mull over today, something that takes this concept into a slightly different arena. Think about how this framework applies beyond our personal interactions and into how we consume information on a daily basis.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. In an era dominated by clickbait, sensationalized headlines, and constant algorithmic persuasion, what if we started demanding high-probability communication from our media and our leaders? What would a world look like where the people in power stopped trying to aggressively persuade us into a state of panic or outrage and instead just presented the factual realities and asked, is this the direction you want to go or not?
It is a fascinating lens through which to view the information economy. If we stop rewarding the manipulation of our attention, we might fundamentally change the quality of the information we receive.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you take these ideas, examine the paradigms you are currently operating in, and experiment with dropping the need to persuade. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. See you next time.